And South Africa was also boycotted from the Commonwealth Games, which doesn't really apply to anyone here, but if you're part of a country that used to belong to the British Empire, is kind of a huge deal. Their cricket teams were also boycotted, which who knows what cricket is, right? Consumer boycott happened around the world, starting in 1959 with European solidarity groups boycotting fruit and tobacco coming from South Africa. It got a huge boost when the Trade Union Council of Britain and the anti-apartheid movement, which was the actual name of an organization, not just like the movement, produced this list of 40 products to avoid. And that's when consumer boycott in Britain specifically really became something that anybody could do. It was just a matter of making your choices in the supermarket. And I think you'd find several lists like this for the US now. I know there's folks boycotting Trader Joe's or not boycotting Trader Joe's, but complaining to Trader Joe's about Israeli products. Certainly Ahava Cosmetics, Motorola, things to avoid, but we'll get to that later. And in the 1980s, the Finnish Transport Workers Union really they enacted a boycott, like a complete boycott of South African goods. Not by themselves, but the union itself kind of made it concrete. They refused to ship anything from South Africa. It's very hard to sell merchandise if you can't get it from the port to the supermarket. So that was a huge victory. Cultural boycott, musicians, playwrights, screenwriters, actors, artists all got on board. Segregated venues in South Africa sometimes were specifically boycotted, like Sun City. Others applied more of a blanket boycott, where they just refused to perform anywhere in South Africa. A lot of playwrights and film directors had clauses in their contracts that said that none of their work could be performed or screened in South Africa. So it was really like a total boycott, that they couldn't connect with the rest of the world in any way. And the reason that this worked is because everybody worked together. The entire line, from the dock workers unloading the cargo, to the truck drivers taking it from the harbor to the grocery store, to the purchasing agents at the stores, to the clerks. There was an Irish checkout lady who spawned this whole movement in Ireland because she refused to touch South African grapefruits. So nobody going through her grocery line could buy South African grapefruits. And it was this huge deal. So one person's, she's kind of like the Rosa Parks of South African grapefruit. You can make a big difference, but you make a much bigger difference if you're working together. So don't get isolated, make friends. Divestment solidarity with South Africa was pretty big. In the U.S., it started with a call in 1960 to stop buying strategic resources. As you may know, there's a lot of gold in South Africa, and for a long, gold is kind of valuable. So, encouraging the United States not to prop up their currency with South African gold, not to buy iron from South Africa, things of that nature. And at the same time, transportation workers in the U.S. started to refuse shipment of South African goods. Of course, pressuring banks not to make loans to corporations doing business in South Africa was another huge thing. South Africa, their currency was really propped up by a lot of foreign direct investment and holding foreign currency. So refusing to make those loans, refusing to locate your business in South Africa was a really big deal. Another strategic thing about this movement was that it included institutional investors. Rather than trying to find every single person who owned stock in a corporation that was doing business in South Africa, it was focused on churches, labor unions, universities, foundations, insurance companies, anybody that has a pension, essentially. And that's something that I think is clearly being replicated as we're talking about divestment in universities today. Another thing to mention is the Sullivan Principles, which was this list of what was acceptable and what was not acceptable as far as doing business in South Africa. What made a corporation boycottable? And there's a lot of ecstatic, I guess you could say, over this, and the possibility of sort of copying something like that for the Palestinian BDS movement. A lot of people said that the Sullivan principles allowed people to continue investing in South Africa with a clean conscience, that it was a half measure, and that it was completely inadequate and it didn't comply with the South African call for complete BDS. A lot of people have been harassing me to create Sullivan principles for Israel, and I don't think that's my job, frankly, but as far as products go, I think everybody has to come up with their own, what's acceptable. Are we going to boycott everything that comes from Israel? Are we going to boycott things that are, clearly tied to occupation and apartheid? But with academic and cultural boycott, that's sort of been done for us by the Palestinian Committee on Academic and Cultural Boycott, or CACB. I also want to point out that from the time that the African National Congress first called for international solidarity and the time that apartheid actually ended was 44 years. So we need to be in this for the long haul. As folks have pointed out, we're moving a little bit at a faster pace than that, but it's still going to take a while. So, campus BDS is crucial, and I encourage all of you to, start your campaigns, but don't let it stop when you graduate. If you're in a church, take it there. If you're in a union, take it there, and just keep pushing, because we're going to be doing this for a while. Campus divestment, specifically in South Africa, the strategy was to sell all South African related securities, so that included South African companies, obviously, but also any corporation doing business in South Africa. So there was a huge list of these, particularly JP Morgan Bank and Shell Oil were targeted. There were lots of fun tactics, including taking over offices on campus, sit-ins, building shanty towns. You might think about the parallel being like building a checkpoint. And just to, sort of, I think 1977 was when Hampshire divested, the first college to divest from South African apartheid. And that was, 30 years, 20 years after the South African call for BDS? I'm not very good at math, but I know it was a long time. Then it's 53 by 1985. Then it really gets rolling. It, more than doubles by 1987. By 1988, over 50 campuses have completely divested from anything related to South Africa. 155 have at least some divestment policy towards South Africa. So again, this is a movement that's going to build momentum as we go on. Don't get discouraged that we're in the early phases right now. We're way ahead of the curve compared to South Africa, so yay us. Banks, as I said before, were specifically targeted for their role in propping up the South African apartheid regime. These are just statistics. A lot of banks were targeted, and it was always a broad coalition. Faith communities, labor groups, community groups. One organization going to a giant multinational bank and saying this is bad, you should stop making loans to South Africa, or in our case to Israel, is not going to make a difference. But if you can show that you represent a much broader spectrum of society, they have to take you seriously. The Barclays divestment initiative in Britain, Barclays Bank, one of the biggest banks in Britain, they also had they were also the biggest bank in South Africa at the time because so many other banks were forced to withdraw. And they actually, once student boycott got going in Britain, they lost 17% of their market share of the British people who had just personal accounts in banks. So again, if you have a big enough group, you're really going to